In this presentation, I'm going to talk about how you get started with a research project. And this is something that the textbooks and most methods classes just don't, they might talk about it, but I feel it's underemphasized because it's very difficult and it's the first step, and you really need to get off to a good start, whether you're doing a capstone paper, a research paper, or anything. So this is how I think you want to deal with the question of how do I get started. So first of all, what are we trying to do, right? And I always like to say, okay, scientific inquiry. King, Cohen, and Verba in their Designing Social Inquiry say, look, scientific research is designed to make descriptive or explanatory inferences based on empirical information about the world. Now, we don't like descriptive so much. Right? Very often we are looking for explanatory, that is something about causality, inferences based on empirical information about the world, right? So that's what we're trying to do here. However, I always went in my head to something that William Riker, one of my professors, said, and we were talking about approaches in this philosophy of science, and I said, we're here at University of Rochester, we do so many different things, what are we about? And Riker said the key thing is when we utter a sentence about reality, we do something to prove it's right. Now, of course, we don't prove anything, and so he was speaking colloquially, and I mentioned to him, he's like, well, you know what I mean. And I'm like, okay. The point is, we're trying to find evidence. We're trying to do a test in some kind. We're making a sentence about reality, something that tells a story about the world. And maybe we've already got one because people have got ideas about the world, but we're going to try to do something to figure out whether or not it's right. That's the overarching goal here. Now, when we do research, there are standards of research, and there's nothing authoritative, and people may put this differently, but the way I look at it, first, interest. Your topic must be a non-trivial, generalizable aspect of international relations, if international relations is what you're doing. If you're more generally in political science, it's your field, right? It has to be germane to your field. Non-trivial, right? It can't be just, a minor thing. And we generally like it to be generalizable, right? When we look at an event, we very often think, okay, what is this a category of, right? So if we're looking at the Arab Spring, what is this a category of? Insurgency, revolution, authoritarian, transition to democracy. What are we talking about here? So that's the first thing. The second thing is accumulation. Research must build on previous scholarly work. We do not reinvent the wheel. And we like to build, and we like to stand on the shoulders of the folks that went before. And for all the talk about plagiarism, which is important, it is important because we are in fact going to be using the research and thinking of other people quite a bit. And so we need to distinguish what's ours versus theirs. Originality. We're going to stand on the shoulders of people, but we're going to reach higher or reach in a new direction. Research must go beyond previous scholarly work. And this sometimes scares people. How can I do something original? How can I find... If you do the steps of research and you go through and you look at what people have done, there are plenty of opportunities to do something different, to move a little bit farther, to look in a different direction. It is doable. And you always want to say, okay, here's what I'm doing that's original. And it doesn't, we don't look for people to solve the world's problems, but you do need to go a little bit farther. And finally, the method, right? Research must employ a scholarly method. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, standards for methods. It's empirical, right? This is the thing. We are going to look at data from the world. Now, there is theoretical research, and you can do theoretical research. When I'm talking research methods, though, usually when you have a research paper, you're trying to look at the world. And even when people do theoretical research, you're looking for testable propositions from it that could be tested in the world. And the best research goes on to test them. But generally, we're looking at data from the world. Systematic. This is the key thing. follows pre-described steps. Who describes them? You do, right? In your methodology section. But we're looking for a systematic approach to the research. We want to see that you've laid out steps and, that you have a reasonable, describable, pre-planned approach to looking at the data from the world. And part of that is we're looking to see, there's this idea of transparency or reproducibility in the hard sciences, right? In the hard sciences, when they conduct an experiment, they like to reproduce it. I say we're looking at transparency. Are you describing the steps fully so people can follow what you're going to do, right? And can they see each step along the way so they understand, all right, you're defining your variable this way, you're getting the data to measure your variable this other way, and then you are going to look at it and you're going to do a crosstab, you're going to do whatever. It's every step along the way is something that you can explain what you're doing and others can follow it and they could reproduce it. There's no black box. You aren't talking out of your head or based on experience or intuition or opinion. It's through steps that can be communicated and cross-examined and looked at and go, okay, I see what you're doing here. Finally, and this is something that maybe I have here that is maybe different, but I'd like to say it's got to be persuasive. The end result must provide some support for the conclusion, right? You've got to come up with something. Now, it doesn't have to be a big find, but, you've got to have some way that your findings, in fact, answer the question. And when you design it, you want to say, all right, hey, here's this question and this key case that they talk about, it puzzles them. So let's look at it more in greater depth and examine these three aspects of it. And the point is, when you do that, when you go through those described steps, is there just kind of an inference to be made? Because remember, that's what they say. We're making inferences about the world. Well, at some point, you're going to say, all right, this is what I found. You're going to have what I sometimes like to call the hard kernel of empirical truth. You're going to have your factual findings. Well, what's the implication? What's the broader conclusion you're making from that? And that's what I mean by being persuasive at the end. Okay, now when we try to look at the world, we typically frame our topics and frame our inquiries in terms of variables, the dependent and independent variable, right? The dependent variable is a thing generally that's being explained. And most research starts with, hey, I want to explain something like, in realism, the occurrence of war. And then the point of the theory is to identify and test independent variables, right? Do these things affect the dependent variable? And for some reason, we don't like to call them causes, but they're causes, right? We're trying to get at causality. What is the relationship between variables? What are the causal relationships? So very often you say, okay, here's a dependent variable, and I'm looking for an independent variable. And realism, for instance, looks at balance of power and maybe distribution of capabilities. But, right, that's the key thing. You're searching for independent variables that explain your dependent variable. Now, when doing research, a question I often ask students or anyone who's doing this is, what is your dependent variable, right? Are you clear about what it is you are trying to explain? Because sometimes people will look at aspects and things can be independent variables or dependent variables. There's dynamic relationships out there and you could have feedback from things. And so it is very important to be very clear what your dependent variable is. It's also important to understand that sometimes you might be interested in an independent variable. You might be interested in looking at a causal factor, and trying to figure out what its effects are, right? You might be interested in saying, well, when there are U.S. military bases somewhere, what are the impacts when we have bases on the other country? Well, now you've got the independent variable. That's where you're starting, and you're looking for effects, and you're looking for dependent variables. That research can be a little bit more difficult Because most research, when you go searching for things, most research is based on the dependent variable, and people will, papers are written, titles, topics are based around the dependent variables. So that's something you can do that, right? You can look for the effects of phenomena in the world and therefore start with the independent variable. That's reasonable, but it is a complicating factor you got to be aware of. So I always say, look, when you're doing research, you're going to conduct a literature review, right? That whole accumulation thing. And that's the first step of a good process, right? You say, I'm going to do my research, and on this, I've got this general topic. Let me look at the literature. Let me see what's been done. And very often, I mean, the lit review is a product. It's something you write for your final paper, to be sure, but it's also a process where you refine your interests and you determine the aspect of the problem in which you're most interested. And you figure out how other folks have defined concepts, right? You identify concepts and you say, oh, all right, here are ways that they're defined. And you really want to go in, I always describe it as looking for opportunities. You're looking for either gaps in the research, you're looking for debates within the research, and you want to say, all right, I'm going to try to do something here, right? I'm going to look at some aspect of it. You always want to try to pick an aspect of it that you can, where you can pose your question in a way that it can be answered, where you can say, hey, look, I'm going to look at two sides of the debate. I'm going to look at the data, and the data is going to support one side or the other. Well, what if it doesn't, right? What if you don't have expected results? Is it significant that the data doesn't resolve it, right? If you get a negative result, can you say something about that, right? So you always want to be in your head considering possible answers or alternatives as you're developing this question. Now, I've been talking about this process. Let's just finish up by going through, hey, what's this overarching process? How do I see this starting out, right? How do you get started? Well, first step is I always put it this way, determine your interest, right? Here you complete the phrase, I'm doing my paper on. That's it, right? You've got a topic. That's your overarching topic. The key thing here is interest. You have to be interested in the topic to write a paper on it. So you start with that. Then you survey the literature, right? And you got to do research to start doing research, right? You immediately, once you say, all right, I want to do my paper on this, well, get to work. Start surfing the journals online, right? And you're looking to do the lit review, basically. You're going to survey the literature, surf online journals, and you want scholarly articles because they are not only the subject, they're the science, the literature that you're going to need to review. They have lit reviews themselves. They will point you in the right direction, and you will after finding a couple articles that are in your zone that look like they're related, hey, they'll start talking about previous research, and you get an idea. Maybe this book's important to read, right? So, and you're looking to answer, questions. How are the issues, in which you're interested in broken up? How have people defined key concepts? I always say, what questions have people asked? How have they posed them? And what answers have people provided these questions? Also, probably should add it here. What are the methods they've used, right? Can you find interesting methods that, you can, provide a tool for your toolbox, right? So that's what you've got to do immediately. And that, until you do that, it's really hard to know what you can do and to really advise you if you're a student or to help you out if you're a friend, if you haven't done this. Then, as a result of surveying the literature, you narrow the topic, right? You come out, and I always say you start with your general topic and you end up with a research question, right? Now, sometimes I keep looking for a phraseology to say, hey, I'm interested in, what makes coups effective, right? And so I want to see what makes military coups more effective, and you're in the end going to maybe look at several cases of coups and test the theory, right? So you're going to narrow it down. It's going to become more focused, and you're going to end up saying, all right, so your research question is, I'm going to examine these 5 coups and test whether these factors that are identified in the literature, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 are there, right? And you get down to a very specific question that can be answered by looking at facts. Yet your general topic is still what makes a coup more effective, right? You're going to draw inferences from those factual findings to come up with your general conclusions, right? And so you're not leaving that original idea or that original topic of interest. You are getting down to some more narrow question, right? So I always say the lit review ends in a question. What do I really want to look at data to figure out, right? And so you're going to, focus on that particular aspect. I always say it's better to be narrow and deep than broad and shallow, right? And you want to go in and identify that. So that's kind of what I see. And all of this comes out to, go survey the literature, your interest interacting with what's already been done, you looking through and, going through the literature and saying, here's what they've done. And maybe at some point you say, what they really need to do is, wait, what? That's your aha moment. When you identify the gap, when you have the thing that makes you go, I don't know. That is where you really focus in on what you want to do. And so that is what I see as being how you get started in general.